I have finally completed Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. My god, did I never think this day would come. I really liked this book, but I have no plans to ever read it again, if that makes sense. If you remember my review of The Goldfinch, where I talked about how I loved it, but it wasn't just incredibly long, it felt long as well. Take this book is that times 20 times 100 even. In fact, I'm putting it down. Normally I hold up a book for most of the video, but I mean, come on, I'm gonna get a wrist cramp. I'm not doing it. These might be fighting words, but I did not think this was as good as Piranesi. In a lot of ways, they are the same story. It's a book about two characters in a magical world, someone who has all of the answers and is like a mentor figure. Over time, we start to appreciate that they're more of the villain in the story. And then the other character is this apprentice figure who like craves all of the knowledge that the other one has, wants the answers. And in that pursuit, we come to respect them as like the heroic character. You know, like the two books are more or less the same thing. So to see Piranesi, in my opinion, portray a more successful relationship, more successful characterization as well, in less than a fraction of the length. Like Piranesi is a very small book. This, over 1,000 pages, so much of it was unnecessary. So much of it. And I had to take so many breaks in the reading experience. Like I would read hundreds of pages at a time, and then I would just have to take days out of it because I was like, you know what, I am exhausted. I need a breather. And it's a shame because I think a tighter edit would have made this much more enjoyable. Of course, we haven't talked about the biggest positive of this story, which is, of course, the world building. The world building in this story, if you are like a fantasy author, like a budding fantasy author that wants inspiration, Susanna Clarke gives you a masterclass in world building. Like, it is the gold standard. You can see completely the impact that this book has had on the genre, like how it's been used as a point of inspiration for so many authors. Because this book, in a lot of ways, it's Babel by R.F. Kuang. Like the focus on academia, the way that it almost sort of reads like a textbook, right down to like the giant footnotes. All of that was incredibly Babel to me. And so it makes sense. Like R.F. Kuang has like a testimonial on the front saying like, oh, this is a book I wish I'd written. And it's like, you more or less did. Like if you're a fan of Babel, I think you will have a lot of love for this as well. V. Schwab also writes the introduction to this version, and again, I think I've not read any V. Schwab, but to my knowledge, Vicious takes a lot of inspiration from this book. The sort of relationship between these two characters with supernatural abilities and their rivalry over time. That again feels like a direct link to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I suppose for me, and this is personal preferences completely, I wish it had gone down the more historical route because it's there. Like, we're in the 19th century, there's lots of, like, excerpts and characters, like we see the prime ministers of the time, we see, like, the Duke of Wellington, we see Lord Byron for quite a bit of it. He was quite funny. But I suppose for me, the way the blurb presented it, I thought the Napoleonic Wars would have more of a feature in the story when realistically, past the halfway point, all of that's done. Like Jonathan Strange helps on the Spanish Peninsula. He helps the British like fight against the French, and he also helps at like Waterloo. But then once that's done, it didn't play as big of a part as I wish it had done because I love that part of history and I think there could have been some really interesting stuff pulled from it, and I think their rivalry could have been more interesting if the two magicians had been on either side of the war, like if they found a way to get maybe like Mr. Norrell working for Napoleon. I don't think that would have happened though because this book is incredibly English. Like it plays up and down this tiny island, like from London to Yorkshire to Shropshire to Wiltshire. It's a very English book. There were moments as well, and I remember feeling this way in Piranesi too, where I want Susanna Clarke to write a horror story. Yeah, I want her to write like a gothic horror story, because there are moments in both of these books where you can see it right on the precipice of like making that turn, like, oh, should things get really dark and twisted? And me reading this, I'm like, yes, of course, make it horrifying. But she never quite takes that leap. So, Susanna Clarke, if you ever see this, of course, you're not going to see this, but I am so here for you to write some like gothic Victorian horror. I think you would be incredible at that. Because the man with thistledown hair, okay, without giving away too much of the plot, because you'll be surprised how like abstract and concise the plot is based on like the actual size of the book. Like it's over 1,000 pages, but realistically, it's just like, oh, magic gets reintroduced to modern day England, or rather 19th century England, and yeah, it's difficult to control. Like that's the story. We have these two magicians and their rivalry. But yeah, it's very simple. But the thing with the man with thistledown hair, so he's a fairy. He comes from like the land of Fae, and I've never read like Fae novels before, and I got scared because my knowledge of that subgenre has been tainted by book talk. So I immediately think of like ACOTAR and SJM. I'm like, oh god, no. But no, it wasn't anything like that to my knowledge. The man with thistledown hair was scary, you know, and there's a real slow burn where we start to see his character more and more, and he's like this entity of chaos that's like causing all of the trouble between our two main magicians. And I think it could have been more intense. There definitely could have been a lot more drama to this and a lot more stakes involved. And I think that's why this book is so like fundamentally English, because all of the characters are so like highbrow that they're like above the drama. Like there's so many issues and moments where characters could be more angry than they are, but because it's like polite 19th century England, they're all just like, oh, that perturbed me, which I find funny, but also just it could have been. I prefer like bigger. I don't know. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the book never really hits a climax, which is frustrating. Like these two magicians have such a long rivalry. You want to see them duel. You want to see them have like a magic battle, you know? Like that would have been so entertaining. Maybe one of them dies. Maybe there's a real dramatic send off. It's, you know, very like Anakin and Obi-Wan on Mustafar. They have like a, you know, you were my brother, Anakin. I loved you. Like I would have been here for that. But no, that does not happen. And I suppose because of the genre, it's more like cozy fantasy. Like we there's no rising tensions, there's no real need for a climax, I suppose. But then what's the payoff? You know, like this book is so long, and I feel like at the end of it, there wasn't this huge sense of satisfaction. I was just like, oh, that was nice. I think this is definitely a book that puts like the plot and the surrounding world above like the characters and their relationships to each other, because there are things that happen that I just don't necessarily believe based on what I was told. Like we're supposed to believe that Jonathan Strange and his wife Arabella have this really close relationship, and that's like a driving factor for what happens later. But their marriage seemed kind of terrible to me. Like he was never really there. He wasn't really there for her. He was too consumed by academia. And Mr. Norrel as well. He's one of the two main characters, but he barely features in a lot of this book. Like the whole middle act is just Jonathan Strange. We see Norrel at the start, and then we see him more at the end. But I don't know, some of this felt a bit uneven to me. But that's not to say that I didn't like this book. I did. I think Susanna Clarke is a fabulous author, like real top drawer, like fantasy. But if I could read Piranesi 4 times or just read this one time, I would read Piranesi 4 times. Honestly, yeah, I would.